As the release of Ulduar is fast approaching, you're probably asking yourself, how well does each class perform in this raid? What are going to be the classes that really shine early on or later in the phase and really are kind of the top tier classes in Ulduar? Even if that's a bad way of saying it, it is a reality. So today we're going to talk about the top 3 classes, in particular talking about DPS, for Ulduar. And these classes I'm thinking about for early game Ulduar as well as late game, where they will kind of shift in how good they are slightly, but these are still going to be the 3 classes that shine extremely well. I do have to say, Ulduar is a very unique raid. This is the first raid we've encountered in all of Classic where every single boss, for the most part, has some actual mechanics that actually fully change the way you play each of your classes. There's also bosses with particular buffs that greatly increase the DPS of certain classes while not doing nearly as much for other ones. So those classes can shine on those particular fights. And there's going to be some that really shoot up in certain fights, but those particularly might not be mentioned on this list. This list, again, guys, is for the overall entirety of Ulduar as a raid. Of course, there is going to be a special mention of one class that I think is the resident sleeper class for next phase, so stay tuned to the end if you want to see that. Now, the third class on my list today is going to be the Rogue. Usually I'm talking about particularly assassination, but there are some fights such as Kolagarn and Ariaya and a few others that are extremely powerful to switch to combat because you have cleave, which literally is basically doubling your DPS for the duration of it being up. So we will see combat rogues do ridiculous numbers on certain fights. The class in general scales extremely well throughout the entirety of the Wrath of the Lich King expansion. Rogues are pretty much always going to be topping some fights as well as being near the top in a lot of other situations. And during phase 1, we did see rogues rise to the top of the overall meters. Rogues absolutely shining in speedruns or overall DPS through raids using some cheeky fan of knives technology. Now, the assassination rogue is extremely strong on almost every fight in Ulduar. There are some fights where being a melee DPS can be a bit of a hindrance where you're not necessarily getting buffed as much as some of the casters, but without a doubt, there are some things that rogues can do that absolutely make them vital for progression, and then as they scale really well with getting gear in the raid, really vital for most of the encounters. Now, in particular, rogues almost never die, which is very, very important in Ulduar early phases. Because of the nature of the raid, there is significant amounts of AoE damage that can go out, and there's a few abilities that rogues can absolutely ignore with Cloak of Shadows. But one thing that most people don't really expect from rogues to use is actually using Feint. Now, rogues currently right now have actually figured out that using Feint on single target situations instead of Tricks of the Trade is a DPS gain for themselves. It's a cheeky thing to do, kind of not fair, but it is a true thing. But did you know that Feint actually gives you a 50% damage reduction from AoE abilities? This means you can live through significantly more things happening in the raid and continue to DPS the bosses when a lot of your raid will be dead. Especially as you progress through these hard modes, there's going to be so many situations that you can just eat the mechanic just because of utilizing Feint and continue to DPS. Now, we all should know by now that uptime is king when talking about DPS. If you're staying in and continuing to hit a boss, then you're gonna do more damage overall in general, unless your class is very weak comparatively, than anyone that has to run out and dodge mechanics. So this is going to be one of the biggest reasons why rogues are gonna be extremely useful and potentially stackable early on in this phase. But that also translates to later on in this phase where rogues are doing phenomenal damage on single target situations, as well as those cleave situations I was talking about earlier. Number 2 on this list may kind of surprise you, and that is going to be the Unholy Death Knight. Now, I'm talking about Unholy Death Knight, but Frost Death Knights, especially for Alliance, are still going to be one of your most powerful classes, and you can absolutely stack them. But Unholy Death Knights are going to be, for the most part, the powerhouse in this raid for a lot of the fights. And that's for a few different reasons. One, Unholy DKs scale phenomenally well, and from all simulations, currently Unholy DKs, even at a 3-minute fight situation, are still doing the highest single target DPS throughout an entire raid if we look at all of the classes right now. One thing that's very important to note there is that 3-minute fights are quite literally the worst length of fights you can have for a Unholy DK, because your gargoyle is exactly a 3-minute CD. Technically, I guess you could say like a 3-minute and 15-second fight would be the worst, but either way, that is the weakest we are going to look comparing ourselves to other classes. Now, Unholy DKs are obviously the kings of burst in Wrath of the Lich King, and they continue to scale phenomenally well throughout this entire expansion, much more than they ever did before on private servers, with multiple things that actually go into that I won't really dive into today. But instead of being just a burst powerhouse spec, Unholy DKs, if they play well, are ridiculously useful in this raid. And that's because a lot of the bosses actually have massive DPS checks that are actually phased out. What that means is you might need to hold off on DPS at a certain portion, and then for the last phase of a boss, you might need to absolutely giga pump and push as much as you possibly can. This is going to be very vital for a lot of the hard modes, and this is where Unholy DKs shine. Those small burst windows are by far the strongest actions of the Unholy DK. Now, the important thing to note here is you have to play correctly for the Unholy Death Knight to really shine in these moments, but they can absolutely easily push your guild over into that DPS check that you needed to be able to down a boss. One thing that they definitely need to focus on is making sure that they're tracking all of their ICDs. Things like trinket procs and knowing when a trinket will be back available to proc, and being able to know that they don't need a DPS right now because the DPS check is about to happen. Now, this sort of situation applies to many of the fights throughout Ulduar, and that's why Unholy Death Knights are so powerful just as DPS powerhouses. And before I move on, I do want to mention that DKs also come with phenomenal self-sustain and other CDs where they can use things like anti-magic shield, which they can actually protect themselves from a lot of the mechanics. You can just eat mechanics just like rogues and stay in, as well as Icebound Fortitude, which does a similar thing but for physical damage. Moving on to number 1, the class that I think is probably the most stackable, especially early on, easy to support, easy to deal phenomenal damage, and also easy to survive, and that is going to be the Warlock. Phase 2 is kind of the phase of the Warlocks. This is where we see a huge jump in the DPS numbers of Warlocks themselves, but we're already seeing Warlocks in general be pretty much the strongest or second strongest class even in Phase 1. So Phase 2, we see this go up even more. Now, Warlocks are doing insane amounts of DPS, very close to everyone at the very top, including most fights they'll actually be the highest DPS because there's a lot of mechanics in this raid that actually significantly boost their DPS. Things like the Assembly of Iron giving you a 50% damage increase, and that damage increase does apply to Corruption because percent damage increases do actually go into your snapshots. On Hodir, you're getting 50% haste as well as massive DPS and crit damage, so Warlocks will do ridiculous pump on this fight. On General Vesex, you're also getting 100% extra magical damage while standing in the goo. All of these things in this raid scale phenomenally well for Warlocks in particular. Some fights can scale a little better for other classes, but Warlocks throughout this entire raid are just phenomenally consistent and always going to be one of the most stackable classes. Warlocks have a ton of HP, so they can survive most of the mechanics that currently 1 or 2 shot most of the players in the raid, so it'll make it a lot easier for you to progress through the raid itself if you bring multiple Warlocks. Now, both Warlock specs, Demonology and Affliction, are seeing their times to shine. They are doing phenomenal DPS, and there's a lot of situations where you might need some extra cleave damage, where Demonology is just gonna destroy pretty much everyone, and then situations where you're just sitting back and blasting, and Affliction locks are hard pumping. I do want to give a quick shout out to Destruction locks. If you do have an off spec that you're not utilizing right now, maybe pick up Destruction for the Freya encounter. It just makes things extremely easy if you have an AoE stun, and it just helps out with all of the DPS and dealing with the ads. Warlocks and most casters in general do get a lot of their gear now from hard modes, now that the hard mode gear is buffed, so you will see a lot of people fighting for all of the gear you want. So if you want to scale really well, you're definitely gonna wanna be doing these hard modes, but you might have some struggles getting all of your gear. So be warned, there's a lot of people fighting for your gear. And also know anything from Algalon is gonna be really hard to get. Like really, really, really hard for most people to actually get. And if you want to know how hard all of the hard modes are, I did a hard mode tier list with my boys Crix, Rugs, and Zyrene, and I'll have that linked up there or something and in the description. And before I send you guys off, I'm going to give you this huge honorable mention, and that is actually going to be to the cheekiest class that you might not have expected. That's gonna be the Mage. Fire Mage, Arcane Mage, Frostfire Bolt Mage, all of the specs of mages are doing actually insane DPS in Ulduar. Now they scale phenomenally well with their gear in this raid, as well as Fire Mage is one of the highest scaling classes in the entire game, so it's only gonna continue to get stronger. But there's also some of the fights that have ridiculous buffs for mages. In particular, Hodir, if you're trying to hit that hard mode, I've seen mages already hit something like 28k DPS, and as we scale with more gear, that's only gonna go up and up and up. And there you have it, guys. Those are the top 3, with an honorable mention, DPS classes in actual Ulduar. This is looking at, again, early phase as well as late game, coming in with both things like your actual survivability or your toolkit, as well as your actual DPS itself. And as we end up dealing with this raid more and more, all of the fights are gonna get shorter, whereas we will see those classes with huge bursts just shine even stronger. And before I send you guys off, I do wanna say that there's gonna be a ton of content coming out on the channel, prep guides, boss tips and tricks, BIS lists, and everything you really want to know about Ulduar and Phase 2. And I'm gonna be hopefully releasing most of the content early over on the channel memberships. So if you want to support the channel and help me continue to actually be able to make these videos, then make sure to check out the channel memberships below, and I will have a link to it right in the description, as well as there's a lot of times when I find a cheeky new item or somebody sends me something about a cheeky new quote unquote exploit, and you can actually get the videos there early so you can utilize them or buy the items and make a ton of gold before it gets popularized. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in Ulduar.